My husband left for a business trip and disappeared for 2 years. But one day, an unknown woman called me. Ma'am, I need to tell you something about your husband. Behind her stood a child. Good day, dear listeners. It's Briella again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. There are moments in life when you look back and realize the signs were always there. You just didn't want to see them. My name is Sarah Mitchell. In the spring of 2021, I was 34 years old, living in a craftsman house on a quiet street in Austin, Texas, with my husband of 7 years, Daniel. We had a golden retriever named Scout, a vegetable garden in the backyard that I kept meaning to tend properly, and a life that, from the outside, looked exactly the way a life was supposed to look. Daniel was a project manager for a mid-sized construction firm. He traveled for work. That was simply part of the deal. I'd known it when we married. 2, 3 trips a year, sometimes a week long, sometimes 2. I was a freelance interior designer with my own small client base, so I was used to working from home, used to the quiet. I told myself I liked the independence. Maybe I even believed it. We weren't a perfect couple. Who is? We argued about money, about whose turn it was to call the plumber, about the fact that Daniel had stopped coming to my mother's Sunday dinners. But we had history. We had inside jokes and a shared language and a decade of accumulated ordinary moments. I thought that was enough to constitute a marriage. I thought that was, in fact, what a marriage was. In March of 2021, Daniel came home from a project in Denver, kissed me on the cheek, and told me the firm had landed a major infrastructure contract in Charlotte, North Carolina. It would take 18 months, maybe more. He'd be home on weekends when he could. He showed me the paperwork, or what I assumed was paperwork. I didn't look closely. Why would I? He left 2 weeks later with 2 suitcases and his laptop bag, and I stood in the driveway and waved until his car disappeared around the corner. The first few months were unremarkable. He called most evenings. We talked about Scout, about my clients, about the project timelines he described in the vague, technical shorthand of someone who assumes the other person isn't really listening. I ordered furniture for a client's lake house. I planted tomatoes that Scout immediately dug up. Life continued. Then, slowly, the calls started shortening. Not dramatically, nothing that would make you circle a date on a calendar. A 10-minute conversation became 7, then 5. Crazy week, he'd say. Early morning tomorrow. I accepted these explanations the way you accept mild weather, without much thought. By autumn, the weekends home had become irregular. October, 1 visit. November, none. The project hit a critical phase. December. He came for Christmas, stayed 4 days, seemed distracted in a way I couldn't name. He was physically present, but somehow elsewhere. His eyes moving to his phone with a frequency that I noticed, and then told myself I hadn't. I remember asking him, on the last night of that visit, if everything was all right between us. He looked at me with something I now recognize as rehearsed sincerity, and said, "Of course, Sarah, I'm just exhausted." He squeezed my hand. I believed him. January passed. February. By March of 2022, it had been 6 weeks since I'd heard his voice. His texts were brief. Slammed. Talk soon. Miss you. I sent longer messages that went unanswered for days. I called his office line. A woman told me Daniel was in the field. I left a message. He didn't return it. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself this was what long-distance marriages looked like. that I was simply unused to the silence. I took on more clients. I repainted the kitchen. I did what women do when something is wrong and they aren't ready to name it. I kept myself busy. And then, on a Tuesday afternoon in April 2023, my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number. A Charlotte area code. I almost let it go to voicemail. Is this Sarah Mitchell? The voice was low, careful. A woman's voice. Yes, I said. My name is Vanessa Kowalski. A pause. I need to tell you something about your husband. I remember the way the kitchen light looked at that moment. Pale and flat, the kind of light that makes everything look slightly wrong. I remember Scout lifting his head from his bed in the corner. I remember my own hand tightening around the phone. And I remember, over Vanessa's shoulder in the video call, she asked me to switch to 30 seconds later. A child. A boy. 4, maybe 5 years old. Dark-haired, with Daniel's jawline. I sat down very slowly in a kitchen chair. How long? I asked. My voice came out steadier than I had any right to expect. Vanessa looked at me across the screen, and her expression was not what I had expected. It was not triumphant. It was calculating. That, she said, is exactly what we need to discuss. I didn't sleep that night, or the night after. I sat at the kitchen table after the call ended, and I didn't move for a long time. Scout came and put his head in my lap, and I put my hand on him mechanically, and I stared at the wall where Daniel and I had hung a framed print from our honeymoon in Portugal. And I thought, how do you grieve something that isn't dead yet? How do you mourn a life you're still technically living? Vanessa had told me the basics, and she'd told them to me with the precision of someone who had been rehearsing. Daniel had been living with her in Charlotte for the past 21 months. Not in a hotel, not in corporate housing. In her apartment, in her life, at her dinner table every evening. The boy's name was Mason. He was 4. The math, which I did automatically and without wanting to, was unambiguous. Daniel had gotten another woman pregnant during one of his work trips, while we were married, while I was here in Austin, planting tomatoes and repainting the kitchen, and telling myself I was being paranoid. I didn't cry that first night. I think I was too far past the register of ordinary emotion for tears to be the right response. What I felt was something colder and more structural. The sensation of an entire architecture collapsing inward. 7 years. The house. The joint bank accounts. The life insurance policy where we were each other's beneficiaries. The retirement accounts I hadn't checked in 2 years because Daniel handled the finances. That last thought was what made me get up from the table. I went to my laptop and I opened our online banking portal. It took me 3 attempts to remember the password. Daniel had set it up, had always been the one to log in. When I finally got through, I sat very still and looked at the numbers. Our joint checking account, which should have held somewhere around $12,000, held $411. Our joint savings, $22,000 at last count, had been drawn down to just under $3,000 in increments spread across 18 months, each withdrawal small enough not to trigger an automatic alert. The investment account we'd opened together in 2019 had been liquidated entirely. $47,000. Gone. I closed the laptop. I opened it again. The numbers hadn't changed. He hadn't just taken 2 years of my life. He had been systematically dismantling our financial foundation, quietly, methodically, while I thanked him for handling things. I thought about Vanessa, the way she'd looked at me on that video call, not guilty, not apologetic, but watchful, strategic. She had called me for a reason, and I was not naive enough to think it was out of solidarity. She wanted something. I didn't know what yet, but I knew that whatever she was offering me, it came attached to a cost. The fear, when it arrived, was specific and physical. It settled in my chest and made breathing slightly effortful for the better part of a week. I was afraid of being financially destroyed. I was afraid of the legal complexity of a marriage where one spouse had essentially been absent and fraudulent for 2 years. I was afraid of being the woman in the story that people pity, the wife who didn't notice, who was too trusting, who let it happen. But underneath the fear, something else was forming, something quieter and more durable. I had a house, in my name as it happened, because Daniel had had a credit issue when we'd bought it, and we'd agreed to put it in my name alone. I had a professional reputation and clients who trusted me. I had 7 years of marriage that, legally, entitled me to half of everything we had built together, including everything he had moved without my knowledge or consent. Moving marital assets without a spouse's consent isn't just morally wrong. In Texas, it has a name. It's called fraud on the community estate. I knew this because my college roommate, Diane, was a family law attorney in Dallas. I called her on Thursday morning, 4 days after Vanessa's call. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said quietly, but with unmistakable certainty, "Sarah, he made a serious legal error." That was the moment the fear didn't disappear, but it rearranged itself into something I could use. I got out a legal pad. I wrote at the top, what I know, what I need to prove, what I need to protect. Then I started writing. The plan was simple in outline, if not in execution. First, retain Diane formally and file for divorce before Daniel knew it was coming. Second, file a motion to freeze remaining joint assets immediately. Third, document every financial transaction he had made without my consent. Fourth, establish, through whatever means necessary, the full picture of his second life in Charlotte, not for revenge, but because in a Texas divorce court, fault matters. Adultery and fraud on the community estate would affect the property division significantly. I also needed to understand Vanessa's role in this. She had called me. She was not a passive figure. And passive figures do not make calculated phone calls to estranged wives. I didn't call her back. Not yet. I wanted to know more before I gave her any more of myself. I poured Scout's food, made myself eat something, and sat back down at the legal pad. Outside, Austin was going about its Tuesday business. Lawnmowers, a distant siren, the neighbors' wind chimes. Normal life, continuing without my permission. What would you have done, I thought, if you'd found out 2 years earlier? I pushed the thought aside. 2 years earlier was gone. What I had was now. I picked up my pen. I drove to Dallas on a Friday morning with a manila folder of bank statements and a list of questions, and sat across from Diane in her office on the 14th floor of a glass building downtown. Diane had been my roommate for 3 years at UT Austin. She was precise and unsentimental in the way that the best lawyers are, and she looked at my documents the way a doctor looks at an X-ray, without emotion, but with complete attention. "First thing Monday," she said, "I'm filing the petition for divorce. We're going to request a temporary restraining order on all remaining joint financial accounts simultaneously. That prevents him from touching what's left before the court gets involved. Can he fight the TRO? He can try. But the transaction history you've brought me..." She tapped the bank statements. "This is going to be very difficult for him to explain. 18 months of systematic withdrawals, consistent with a pattern of concealment. A Texas court will not look kindly on this." I asked her about Mason, Daniel's child with Vanessa. She told me what I'd already suspected. His paternity, if established, would not directly affect my divorce settlement, but it would corroborate adultery, which in Texas is a recognized fault ground. A judge could, and often did, award a larger share of community property to the wronged spouse in cases of proven adultery combined with financial misconduct. How much larger? I asked. Diane looked at me steadily. Potentially significantly, especially given the fraudulent asset dissipation. We're going to build a very complete picture, Sarah. I drove back to Austin on Friday evening and spent the weekend in a state of deliberate calm. I told no one, except Diane. I did not call Daniel. I went to a client meeting on Saturday morning, installed a wallpaper sample, discussed tile options, behaved like a person whose world had not ended. Because in one sense, it hadn't. It had simply revealed its actual shape. On Monday, Diane filed. I was at my drafting table when my phone buzzed with her text. Done. TRO granted. He'll be served within 48 hours. I set the phone face down and kept working. Daniel called me on Wednesday evening. I let it ring. He called again. Then he texted, "Sarah, I think we need to talk." Then, an hour later, "Please call me." The messages had the particular quality of someone who has just received an unexpected blow and is trying to assess the damage before deciding how to respond. I did not respond. What I was waiting for arrived 2 days later, via Diane, a private investigator's preliminary report compiled over the previous 72 hours using legal public record searches, social media archives, and confirmation from the process server, who had located Daniel at Vanessa's address in Charlotte. I sat at my kitchen table and read it carefully. Daniel Mitchell had been listed on Mason Kowalski's birth certificate. Father, Daniel A. Mitchell. The child had been born in November 2019. I did the arithmetic again, numbly. November 2019. We had celebrated our 5th wedding anniversary in October of that year. I had booked a weekend in San Antonio. We had eaten at a restaurant on the River Walk, and Daniel had given me a bracelet and told me he loved me. 1 month later, his son was born to another woman in Charlotte, North Carolina. I read that line 3 times. There was more. Vanessa Kowalski, 41 years old, worked as an office manager for a commercial real estate firm. She and Daniel had met, according to her own public social media history, which the investigator had archived before any potential deletion, in 2018 at a work function in Charlotte. Photos existed, dated, geotagged, unambiguous. In several of them, Daniel was not wearing his wedding ring. I sat with that detail for a moment. Such a small thing. Such an ordinary act of erasure. The report also included something I had not anticipated. Financial records obtained through the divorce discovery process showed that Daniel had opened a separate personal bank account in Charlotte in early 2020, into which he had been depositing a portion of his salary, a portion that had never appeared in our joint finances. The account had been funded over 3 years to the amount of $63,000. $63,000, built quietly in parallel, while I had believed we were building something together. I called Diane. "This is the point of no return," she said. "Once I submit this in discovery, it becomes part of the court record. He will know exactly how much we know." "Submit it," I said. There was a brief silence on the line. "Sarah, I want you to be prepared. He's going to react. They both might." "I know," I said. "Let them." I hung up and looked around my kitchen. The repainted walls, the window over the sink, Scout asleep in a square of afternoon light. This was my house. My name was on the deed. I had 43 clients who trusted my work, a bank account in my name alone, and a family law attorney in Dallas who was, at that very moment, building a case that would document in exhaustive legal detail every lie Daniel Mitchell had told in the last 5 years. Was I afraid? Yes. But there is a particular clarity that comes when you stop waiting for a situation to improve on its own and decide to impose your will upon it instead. The divorce proceedings had begun. There was no going back now, for any of us. The retaliation came faster than I expected, and it came from both of them at once. On a Monday morning, 10 days after the discovery documents had been filed, I was meeting with a client in her home in the Travis Heights neighborhood, a full gut renovation of a 1940s bungalow, when my phone lit up with a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail and finished my meeting professionally, noted the client's preferences for the kitchen cabinetry, shook her hand, and walked to my car. In the parking strip outside, I listened to the message. It was Daniel, but not the Daniel I had known for 7 years. The voice on the voicemail was tight and clipped, the warmth entirely gone, replaced by something I could only describe as controlled hostility. Sarah, I know what you filed. I know what documents you submitted. I want you to understand something. I have a son. I have a life in Charlotte, and I will protect it. My attorney will be reaching out to Diane, but I'm calling to tell you personally, this does not need to be ugly. Pull back, and we can negotiate something fair for everyone. Fair for everyone. I played it back once. I saved it to my cloud storage and forwarded it to Diane. The call from Vanessa came that same afternoon. She did not bother with the restrained tone Daniel had used. She called from her own number this time, and when I answered, because I chose to answer, because I wanted to hear her directly, her voice was sharp and immediate. You want to make this a war, Sarah? Fine. But you should know, Daniel's income, the accounts, the assets, I know about all of it. I was there. I helped him plan it. And I will testify to whatever I need to testify to in order to protect my son's financial future. Are you hearing me? I let a beat of silence pass. I'm hearing you, Vanessa. Then hear this. If you push forward with the fraud claims, we will countersue. We'll say the marriage was effectively abandoned, that you were aware of the separation and consented to it. We have texts. Daniel and I both have texts, and we are prepared to submit them. I thought about that for a moment. I thought about the texts I myself had sent over the past 2 years. Miss you. When are you coming home? Can we talk tonight? Texts that documented in a time-stamped archive that I had never consented to anything of the kind. That's going to be a difficult argument to make, I said, given 2 years of me asking him to call me back. The silence on her end was brief but informative. Don't test me, she said and hung up. I sat in my car outside the bungalow for a few minutes. My hands were steady. I was slightly surprised by that. I sent everything to Diane, the voicemail, the notes from Vanessa's call, timestamps, exact quotes. Diane called me back within the hour. Her threat about countersuing for abandonment is legally baseless in Texas, she said. Abandonment requires the departing spouse to have left the marital home without consent or justification for at least a year. Daniel left for work, with your knowledge. He maintained the appearance of the marriage, accepted its financial benefits, and misled you about his intentions. No Texas judge will buy an abandonment narrative. What about the claim that she'll testify against me? Let her. Every time she opens her mouth in a courtroom, she confirms the affair. She's not a sympathetic figure, Sarah. She's a woman who helped a married man hide assets from his wife for 3 years. That's not a witness the opposing counsel wants center stage. That was the moment I understood that their aggression was, in its own way, a form of desperation. What followed over the next 2 weeks was a sustained campaign of pressure. Daniel's attorney sent aggressive letters questioning my financial claims. Vanessa called twice more. I recorded both calls legally, with a single-party consent notice I had already researched under Texas law. A mutual acquaintance of Daniel's and mine called, ostensibly, to check in, and spent 12 minutes trying to suggest that I was making things worse for myself. I thanked him politely and ended the call. Then, one Thursday evening, Vanessa drove from Charlotte to Austin. She showed up at my house. I looked at her through the glass panel beside my front door before I opened it. She was tall, dark-haired, and she had dressed carefully for this, the kind of outfit that projects stability and reasonableness. Behind her, parked at the curb, was a rental car. I opened the door. "This is not a conversation I'm having with you without my attorney present," I said. "I'm not here as an adversary," she said. Her voice was modulated now, the sharpness from the phone call replaced with something smoother. "I just want to talk, woman to woman. 10 minutes. "No," I said. "Goodbye, Vanessa." I closed the door. I took a photograph of her rental car's license plate through the window and sent it to Diane. Then I sat on my couch and let Scout climb up next to me, which I normally didn't allow, and I stayed there until the rental car pulled away from the curb, woman to woman. As though shared gender was supposed to dissolve the fact that she had known from the beginning that Daniel was married. Diane filed a formal notice with the court, documenting the unannounced visit as potential witness intimidation. It went into the record. After that, they went quiet. For a little while, I took 4 days off. I drove to Port Aransas, checked into a small hotel 2 blocks from the beach, and did almost nothing. I walked on the sand in the mornings. I ate fish tacos. I turned my phone to Do Not Disturb and only checked it twice daily, at scheduled times, for messages from Diane. I slept 9 hours a night. I let myself be, for 4 days, just a woman at the beach, in the sun, breathing salt air, with no crisis to manage. I needed it. The body keeps score, as they say, and mine had been running on adrenaline for 6 weeks. When I drove back to Austin on a Sunday afternoon, I felt something I could only describe as readiness. Whatever was coming next, I was ready for it. 3 days after I returned from Port Aransas, a letter arrived. Not from Diane's office, not from a court, a personal letter, in a white envelope, with Daniel's handwriting on the front. I stood at the mailbox and looked at it for a moment before I brought it inside. The letter was 3 pages, handwritten, which I understood immediately as a strategic choice. Handwriting reads as intimate, as effortful, as sincere in a way that a typed document cannot. Daniel had always known how to calibrate his presentation. It was, I now understood, one of his most reliable skills. He wrote about Mason. He wrote, and this was carefully done, not as a man defending himself, but as a father describing a child he loved and felt responsible for. Dark-haired, energetic, already obsessed with building blocks and construction trucks. He included a photograph, which I set aside face down without studying it closely. He wrote that he had made catastrophic mistakes, and that he was not asking for forgiveness, only for a chance to resolve things without destroying everyone involved. Then at the end of the second page came the offer. He proposed a negotiated settlement, outside of court, without the fraud claims, without the fault findings. He would give me the house outright and a lump sum payment of $40,000. In exchange, I would drop the fraud on the community estate claims, agree not to contest the divorce, and sign a confidentiality agreement about the details of our separation. $40,000 and silence. I read it twice. Then I set it on the kitchen counter and made myself a cup of coffee. $40,000 against $63,000 in a hidden account, against 18 months of systematically drained joint savings, against 7 years of a life I had structured around a marriage that had been, in crucial ways, a fiction, against the retirement account, the investment account, the marital share of his pension benefits, the legal fees I had already incurred. He was offering me a fraction of what I was legally entitled to, wrapped in handwritten contrition, and he was hoping that my exhaustion, or my sentiment, or my desire to be done with all of it, would make the fraction look like generosity. Was I tempted? I want to be honest. For approximately 45 minutes that morning, I sat with the letter, and I felt the pull of it. Not because the offer was fair, it wasn't, but because part of me was tired. Part of me wanted to take something, close the door, and start over without the ongoing presence of courts and depositions and attorneys' fees in my life. But I had done the math with Diane. My actual legal entitlement, given the asset dissipation, the fraud claims, the adultery finding, was estimated between $120,000 and $150,000, plus the house, plus potentially a share of his future earnings during the period of the marriage. The $40,000 offer wasn't a settlement. It was a buyout of my silence, dressed in the language of remorse. I photographed the letter, sent it to Diane, and wrote on the legal pad, "Declined." The social texture of those weeks was something I hadn't fully anticipated. I had spent so long managing this quietly, telling almost no one, that I had somewhat isolated myself by default. I was not someone who broadcasted personal difficulty. I came from a family that valued composure, and I had, I think, internalized that composure sometimes too completely. But at a client dinner in early May, I found myself sitting next to a woman named Carmen Reyes, an architect I'd collaborated with on 2 projects. We'd always been professionally cordial. That evening, I don't fully know why, I told her. Not everything, but enough. She listened the way people listen when they recognize something. Then she told me that her own first marriage had ended under circumstances that had taught her, she said, that the cruelest lies are the ones told by omission over years. She gave me the name of a therapist she'd seen, and she said, "You don't have to do all of this alone, Sarah. You've been treating it like a solo project." She was right. I also, that same week, called my sister Ellen in Portland. Ellen and I had the kind of relationship that survives long gaps between contact because the underlying foundation is solid. I told her everything. She drove down from Portland the following weekend, slept on my couch for 4 nights, helped me reorganize my home office, cooked elaborate dinners, and reminded me, with her characteristic dry humor and complete absence of pity, that I was not defined by what Daniel had done. "You're defined by what you do now," she said one evening over pasta. "That's very motivational poster of you," I said. "I know," she said. "I've been saving it." I also called my mother, who, once she stopped being furious on my behalf, proved to be remarkably practical. She reminded me that my maternal grandmother had divorced my grandfather in 1974, at a time when divorce still carried real social stigma, and had proceeded to build a business, raise 2 children, and live to 89 entirely on her own terms. "The women in this family," my mother said, have always known when to cut their losses and when to fight. You're doing both, sweetheart. That's not a contradiction. That's wisdom. I started seeing Carmen's therapist, Dr. Annette Park, on Thursday afternoons. I won't say it fixed anything. Therapy doesn't fix things, in my experience. What it did was give me a weekly hour in which I was not managing, not strategizing, not maintaining composure for anyone's benefit. I talked. Dr. Park listened and reflected. Slowly, the cold knot in my chest that had been there since April began to loosen, slightly but perceptibly. And through all of it, the letter, the calls, the quiet weeks of waiting, Daniel and Vanessa watched. I knew they were watching, waiting for me to crack or capitulate or make a mistake. They were going to be waiting for a long time. In the first week of June, Vanessa called to suggest a meeting. The framing was careful. She said she wanted to talk as adults, without attorneys involved, about a path forward that works for everyone. She said she was in Austin. She didn't explain why, and that she would like to meet somewhere neutral. A coffee shop, perhaps. I thought about it for 24 hours. Then I consulted Diane, who said, "You can meet her, but record it. Texas is one-party consent. And say nothing about strategy, figures, or legal positioning. You are there to listen." I agreed to meet at a coffee shop in the South Congress neighborhood on a Thursday afternoon. I arrived first, chose a table near the window in full public view, set my phone to record and slipped it into my jacket pocket, and ordered a black coffee. Vanessa arrived with Daniel. I had not been told Daniel would be present. I absorbed this without visibly reacting, though I noted it for what it was. The first small violation of the stated terms. He looked thinner than the last time I'd seen him, at Christmas, 2022. There were shadows under his eyes. He was dressed in the kind of deliberately casual clothing that men wear when they want to appear non-threatening. And he sat down across from me with an expression that I can only describe as practiced contrition. "Sarah," he said. "Daniel," I said. We looked at each other across a coffee shop table as though we were strangers who had been briefly introduced, which I suppose was, by that point, accurate. Vanessa began. She was measured, composed, and she led with the child. Mason had adjusted well to preschool, she said. He was a good boy, a happy boy. She was not asking me to feel anything particular about Mason. She was presenting him as context, as a human reality that existed beyond the legal dispute. She was, I understood, trying to locate my sympathy and leverage it. "We're not here to fight," she said. "We're here because we want to show you that we're reasonable people trying to do right by everyone." "That's a kind intention," I said. Daniel leaned forward. "Sarah, I know I hurt you. I know nothing I say changes that. But what you're doing, the fraud claims, the full litigation, it's going to cost both of us. The attorney's fees alone." "I'm aware of the costs," I said. "Is it worth it?" he asked. "Is it worth 2 more years of this for the difference between what we've offered and what you think you might get?" What you think you might get. The phrasing was precise and intentional. It was designed to reframe my legal entitlement as an uncertain aspiration, something speculative and possibly irrational, rather than what it actually was. A figure calculated by my attorney based on documented evidence of asset fraud. I looked at him and said nothing. Vanessa, evidently reading my silence as an opening, shifted her approach. "Sarah." Her voice dropped, and the professional smoothness was replaced by something more direct. "I understand you're angry. You have every right to be. But I need you to understand something. Daniel's income is not as large as you may think it is. If you take this to full trial and win everything you're asking for, you will get a court judgment. But collecting on it will take years. He will appeal. He will restructure. You will have won on paper and be financially dependent on a legal system that moves very slowly, while your own life is on hold. She paused and then added, "We can give you something real and certain and soon, or you can wait years for something theoretical." I listened to this. I listened to the entire, carefully constructed architecture of it. The reasonableness at the surface, the threat underneath, the appeal to my fatigue and my practical self-interest. And then I looked at her and I said, "Vanessa, the hidden account alone is $63,000. The drawn-down joint savings and investments bring the total to approximately $142,000 in documented dissipation. My attorney has 3 years of transaction records. What you're describing as theoretical, a Texas court is going to describe as evidence." Something crossed her face. It was controlled, but not quite controlled enough. "You're making a mistake," she said, quietly. The smoothness was gone. "I'll take that under advisement," I said. Daniel said my name and I turned to look at him, and I saw, for the first time since any of this began, something real in his face. Not remorse. Something closer to alarm. "Sarah," he said, "don't do this." "I didn't do anything, Daniel," I said. "You did. All of it." I picked up my coffee cup, finished what was in it, set it down, and stood. "I'm going to ask you both not to contact me outside of official legal channels going forward," I said. "Any further direct contact will be documented and submitted to the court. Have a good afternoon." I walked out of the coffee shop. On the sidewalk outside, in the June heat, my legs were slightly unsteady. I stopped at the corner and stood until they weren't. I was afraid. I won't pretend otherwise. The directness of Vanessa's threat, "You will get a court judgment, but collecting will take years," was not empty posturing. It described a real possibility, one Diane and I had discussed. Litigation is not surgery. Even the best outcomes are complicated and slow. But it was that specific fear, that specific vision of years of delays, of appeals, of being made to fight for what was already mine, that did something unexpected. It made me furious. And the fury was clean and useful in a way that the fear alone had never been. I would not be threatened into accepting less than what I was owed. I walked to my car. I got in. I started the engine. I sent the audio recording to Diane. The hearing was scheduled for the 3rd Thursday of July, in a courtroom on the 4th floor of the Travis County Family Law Center. I had been in that building 3 times prior, once for the initial filing, twice for procedural hearings that lasted less than 20 minutes each. This was different. This was the evidentiary hearing on asset dissipation and the final property division, and it would determine, in concrete terms, the financial outcome of 7 years of marriage. I wore a dark blue blazer and my grandmother's watch. I don't know exactly why the watch felt important, but it did. Diane met me in the hallway outside the courtroom at 8:45. She was carrying 3 accordion folders and had the focused, slightly preoccupied expression of someone who has prepared for this and knows it. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Ready," I said. The courtroom was small and fluorescent lit and entirely unglamorous, which I found oddly comforting. Legal proceedings on television take place in soaring mahogany chambers. The reality is drop ceilings and plastic chairs, and a judge who drinks coffee from a travel mug. It reminded me that this was a practical process, not a theatrical one. I was not here for drama. I was here for the record. Daniel arrived with his attorney, a tall man named Prescott, who had a reputation, Diane had told me, for aggressive procedural tactics. Daniel did not look at me when he sat down. Vanessa was not present. She had no standing in the proceeding. But I learned later that she had been in the building that morning, in the lobby, waiting. Judge Caroline Reyes, no relation to my colleague Carmen, had reviewed the pre-hearing filings and the discovery documents. She was in her early 60s, with reading glasses on a chain and the particular manner of someone who has heard every variety of marital financial complexity and retains the capacity to be disappointed by none of it. Diane presented our case with the economy and precision of someone who knows the evidence is strong and doesn't need to embellish it. The transaction history: 18 months of withdrawals from joint accounts, documented and dated. The hidden Charlotte account, established in January 2020, funded to $63,000 over 3 years, source entirely from Daniel's marital period salary. The retirement and investment account liquidation, dates, amounts, the fact that I had not been consulted or notified. The birth certificate, Daniel A. Mitchell, father. Date of birth, November 2019, during the marriage. Prescott's counter-argument was that Daniel had used the Charlotte account to cover legitimate work-related expenses not reimbursed by the firm, and that the joint account withdrawals represented normal marital spending. Diane had anticipated both. She introduced Daniel's firm's expense reimbursement records, subpoenaed in discovery, which showed consistent and complete reimbursement of his work expenses throughout the relevant period. There was no category of legitimate, unreimbursed expense that could account for $63,000. Then came the audio recording. Diane played the recording of the coffee shop meeting in open court. I watched Judge Reyes's expression as Vanessa's voice, smooth and careful, described a strategy for making enforcement of any judgment slow and difficult, for restructuring assets to delay collection. The judge's face did not change dramatically, but she made a note. It was during the cross-examination of Daniel that things came apart for them. Prescott had coached him well for most of it. Daniel answered questions in a measured, regretful tone, taking partial responsibility while framing the financial decisions as poor judgment rather than deliberate concealment. But Diane is a skilled cross-examiner, and she had been building to a specific sequence. She produced a series of wire transfer confirmations, documents from the discovery that Prescott had apparently not emphasized in his preparation. The transfers showed that in the 6 months before Daniel had initially told me about the Charlotte project, he had made 3 significant payments from his personal account to a real estate agent in Charlotte for a down payment on a lease. Not a hotel reservation, not a corporate housing booking. A personal apartment lease, negotiated and partially funded months before he told me about the Charlotte project at all, which meant the Charlotte posting hadn't been a project he'd been assigned. It had been an arrangement he had sought out and prepared for. The 2-year work trip had been planned in advance, at a minimum. "Mr. Mitchell," Diane said, "is it your testimony that the Charlotte assignment was initiated by your employer?" A pause. Prescott moved to object on relevance grounds. The judge overruled him. "Mr. Mitchell?" Daniel looked at the lease payments on the exhibit in front of him, and for a moment, just a moment, I saw him understand that the question had no safe answer. "I facilitated the assignment," he said. "There was a need, and I indicated I was willing to go." "You indicated you were willing to go," Diane repeated. "And you arranged your personal housing in Charlotte 3 months before telling your wife about the assignment." "I was—" "Yes or no, Mr. Mitchell?" Did you arrange the Charlotte lease before informing your wife of the assignment? Yes. The courtroom was very quiet. Judge Reyes set down her pen. She looked at Daniel Mitchell over her reading glasses for a long moment. Daniel looked at the table. Vanessa, I was told later, left the building at that point, before the ruling. She simply walked out of the lobby and drove away. Judge Reyes issued her ruling from the bench that same afternoon. Unusual, Diane had told me, and a sign that the judge considered the matter sufficiently clear to act without delay. I sat with my hands folded in my lap and listened. The court found that Daniel Mitchell had engaged in fraud on the community estate through the systematic diversion of marital assets, the concealment of income in a separate account, and the liquidation of joint investment holdings without spousal consent. The court further found that adultery had been established as a fault ground through the birth certificate, the documented timeline, and the financial evidence presented in discovery. The property division. The marital home was confirmed as my sole property. The court awarded me 100% of the remaining community property. It ordered Daniel to pay $131,000 within 90 days or face immediate wage garnishment. It awarded me 60% of his pension benefits accrued during the marriage and ordered him to cover my attorney's fees, $22,400. The total financial judgment, approximately $212,000 plus the house. Diane kept her expression professional until we were in the hallway. Then she allowed herself a small, satisfied nod. "That's as complete a ruling as I've seen in a decade," she said. I leaned against the corridor wall and let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding for 4 months. Daniel's face, when I caught a glimpse of it as he left the courtroom, was the face of a man who has just understood the full weight of the choices he made. He did not speak to me. I did not speak to him. Vanessa, I was told, had left the building before the ruling was even issued. She had simply walked out of the lobby and driven away. The divorce was finalized 6 weeks later in a brief administrative proceeding. I signed the documents at Diane's office on a Tuesday morning, drove home, and sat in my car in the driveway for a little while. The Craftsman house looked the same as always. The porch, the garden, the oak tree that had been there long before either of us existed. It was my house, in every sense now. What I felt wasn't triumph. It was quieter. The particular satisfaction of a thing completed, fully without compromise, and documented permanently in a court record that would never change. Diane sent me a bottle of good Texas wine after the finalization. The card read, "For the record, you handled this with exceptional composure. D." I put it on the refrigerator. Scout approved. 1.5 years is enough time for a life to find its new shape. I expanded my design practice in ways I'd been putting off for years, hired an assistant named Priya, meticulous and fast, with strong opinions about tile. I took on my largest commercial project to date in the Muller neighborhood. I spent a weekend in Mexico City and found myself photographing tile work obsessively, the way you do when your creative attention has been released from somewhere it had been held. The house I made more fully mine. I painted the bedroom the color I'd wanted for 2 years, but that Daniel had called too dark. I adopted a second dog from the shelter, a hound mix named Rosie, who became Scout's best friend within a week. Carmen became a genuine friend. Ellen visited 3 times and finally admitted she'd never liked Daniel, which made me laugh harder than I had in months. The financial judgment was paid in full by February, not voluntarily. Diane had filed for wage garnishment on day 91, and compliance became prompt. $212,000. I paid off the house, invested a portion, and set aside what I privately called the Never Again Fund. Liquid savings in my name alone that no one could touch. As for Daniel and Vanessa, they did not marry. The relationship, built largely around the shared project of managing me, developed serious fault lines once that project collapsed against them. The judgment had required Daniel to liquidate much of the Charlotte account, and Vanessa, who had been partly drawn to his apparent financial stability, experienced that change acutely. By the following spring, they were no longer together. Daniel was paying child support, living in a smaller apartment, navigating professional complications the litigation had created. Vanessa was raising Mason largely alone, having stepped back professionally. I took no simple satisfaction in this. Mason was innocent, and her difficulties were also his. But Vanessa had known exactly what she was participating in. She had called me with a calculation, not a conscience. The consequences that followed were the natural result of her choices. On a Tuesday morning in late October, I stood in a half-renovated commercial space, exposed brick, good east light, the smell of sawdust, reviewing final specifications with my contractor. I thought briefly about the woman who had stood at a mailbox answering a stranger's phone call, about to have her life rearranged. She hadn't known the rearrangement would result in something better than what came before. I'm glad she didn't. She needed to find that out for herself. What I learned: know your rights, document everything, and never let exhaustion make you accept less than what you're owed. Being alone is not defeat. A life rebuilt on your own terms can be finer than what came before. So, what would you have done in my place? Leave your answer below. Subscribe for more stories like this. Thank you for listening.